Like, to be very frank, because there's so much DA or ordering bandwidth that is coming to the market, like all DA is going to be very commoditized. Like, it's a no-brainer, right? Like, I mean, fees are going to be low, for example. And so essentially, once you kind of choose your tool stack, once you kind of spin up your chain, right? Like, you're not going to have to figure out or worried about the execution environment or the DA reliability, for example. Like, all of the systems are going to be pretty robust, for example. What you need to figure out then is, where are your users going to come from? Where are you going to pull liquidity from? How do users bridge to your chain? Do people have to bridge via Ethereum from other rollups? Like, how do you bring liquidity to your chain? Like, how do you ensure that users have a very smooth onboarding to your chain, right? Like, you cannot be the 100th EVM rollup with no differentiator, right? Like, I mean, it's very hard.
Anurag, thank you for coming back on the podcast. I've had very few second-time guests, but when I got the opportunity to chat again, I really enjoyed the first time, and so I jumped at it. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and excited to have you back.
Yep. Thanks, Logan, for having me, and very excited to be back.
Awesome. Well, maybe to kick it off, I think we spoke last in September of 2023, and a lot has happened since then. At that point in the time, we were in the depths of the bear market, deep depression and despair, and now we're coming out on the other side. A lot of interesting things have probably happened in the last 8-9 months. Can you maybe talk about just the progress that Avail has made since kind of we last spoke, and some of the news things that the team has been working on?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the last time we spoke, we mostly spoke about the DA product much in detail in general. So a lot of things, as you said, have changed over the last 6 months or so. We announced that ETH Denver, the additional components of what we call the unification layer that we are building at Avail. This is comprised of Avail DA, but also Avail Nexus and Avail Fusion. So this is, like, in line with what where we are thinking the blockchain world is going in general, right? Like, so to zoom out a bit, right? Like, so we started with Avail by building this data availability layer with data availability sampling. And essentially, this is validity proof based. And so this is basically in the direction of where Ethereum is headed in general, from a roll up centric roadmap perspective. And how I like to view this as is the evolution of how blockchains are constructed, right? Like, we began with Ethereum and maybe Bitcoin in some sense, but in general, it was a very L1 specific landscape of building new blockchains. So with L1s, actually, I just did like a tweet in the morning today, is trying to kind of like figure out my mental model of how to look at L1s, rollups, and the new and shiny AVSs from Eigen Layer, for example, right? Like, so in general, so from that point of view, what we can do with L1s is you kind of create this new execution environment, new data modeling, for example, new ways of authentication access, for example, and you kind of create this new L1s. And so we can see, like, of course, after Ethereum, there's been Solana, Sui, Aptos, and bunch of other L1s, a lot of them on the Cosmos side as well, for example. And so these have been different ways of doing blockchains. Rollups, we kind of begin with the assumption that we don't want to start with the L1 security bootstrapping problem. Like, we don't want to create new economic security. We just have a shared notion of cryptoeconomic security at the base layer, and any rollups on top inherit this security. Now, I mean, of course, we can get into the weeds about how current rollups are implemented and so on. So let's go past that. But essentially, theoretically, rollups that are properly implemented inherit the entire security of the base layer. Um, and so that's another way of creating blockchains. And of course, we have now this curious mix between L1s and rollups. Is like AVS is like coined by Eigenlayer, which kind of allow you to kind of bootstrap this chain with restaked ETH, for example. Today, this is with Eigenlayer is doing restaked ETH, but Babylon is trying to bring Bitcoin security, for example. And like Bitcoin and ETH are the big two assets in the industry, already valuable. So these are projects that are looking to repurpose the use of these assets into creating new chains, for example. And these can be any sort of chains. These could be like EVM or SVM sort of rollups, but these could be as diverse as like we had one team creating an intent solver roll up on Avail a couple of weeks back at a hackathon, for example, and so on. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is, like blockchain architecture has been evolving. Like it was a very L1 centric methodology before. Rollups came into the picture around 2020, and so the entire effort around Avail has been to build this infrastructure around rollups. Now, like rollups are pretty great for like mitigating the bootstrapping cryptoeconomic security problem, but they also end up fragmenting the user experience, right? Like, so if I consider like a Solana is like this very scalable chain with a lot of apps, but users, like the experience is pretty straightforward. Just interact with one chain and you can have access to all the apps. The rollup paradigm, on the other hand, right, like says that no, we are not going to have this one, all the apps on one single blockchain. Uh, we are going to have this base layer, then going to be thousands and millions of rollups on top, right? Like very similar to how like let's say I like to think of these as microservices in that sense, asynchronous microservices, and in general, but the user experience gets pretty bad, right? Like because now users have to think about different chains, different RPCs, bridging, so on and so forth. And so if we have to kind of arrive at the user experience that is enough for this technology to go mainstream, you also have to build a substrate around this roll up centric future, right? Like you can't just expect wallets to solve this, or like other places to solve it. It has to be solved from the foundational bit, right? Like so that's why our thinking at Avail is, let's start with this, it's very scalable data availability layer. Data availability is a very misunderstood term, right? Like it's essentially an ordering layer, um, and with like very easy ordering verification via light clients. On top, you can have as many rollups as you want, and the the intent of Avail Nexus, which is a product that we announced very recently, is to allow a shared notion of validity across these rollups, or basically a framework that connects all these rollups together, so that like I like to kind of say this is bringing the monolithic experience to the modular world, right? Like that's how we I like to frame it. Of course, like as with everything, there's a bunch of stuff that we still need to build, create, for example, and so on. But that is how the we envision this in general. And one part of this that we announced again a few weeks back is something called Avail Fusion, which is I think very promising. Is I go back to the earlier conversation where people are trying to figure out how can we use something like a BTC and a ETH, which is already valuable, well entrenched, and how can we repurpose it to securing other chains. And so Avail Fusion is our strategy to kind of utilize BTC ETH, maybe even Sol, for example, to kind of add more cryptographic security to the base layer, so that all the rollups on top can inherit this security. So we are trying to kind of take a more foundational principle to solving these problems that the rollup centric future brings in. So we first, like you can say, we enable rollups, and then we kind of try to solve all the problems that come along with it as well. So I'll just stop here for any
No,
questions.
it's a lot to dive into. I think maybe to start with, how I think the market is still trying to figure out what works from not the technical standpoint, but more where the future is going to go. Because I think the higher level is the roll up centric roadmap has very much been the predominant scaling methodology for the last 3 to 4 years. And it's been interesting now that Solana, particularly, has kind of caught wind, at least on the retail side with meme coins, TBD on kind of breakout products. But at least for the meme coins today, and there's kind of this one version of the future where you have these like high throughput integrated chains, and then you still have the roll up chains. And then you have now the Eigen layers or even the Cosmos. There's a lot of different methodologies going on. Where do you kind of see this all? I mean, and you kind of touched upon it in the end state. Uh, do you feel like there is like 100% probability, 50% probability that they have to end up in kind of the roll up centric landscape? Or where do you envision that kind of future playing out as we're kind of progressing towards that and the market's still trying to figure that out as well today?
Yeah, I think, see, basically, see, we have to kind of understand where blockchains come into the picture in terms of a technology evolution play, right? Like where do blockchains truly fit in the overall landscape, right? Like, and so this is basically the best framing I can give is basically the trust in disintermediation problem, right? Like, I mean, there's a way in which trust has evolved over the centuries, and technology has accelerated the way how trust is kind of managed in that sense, right? Like, so for example, like today you let a stranger into your house on Airbnb, for example, right? Like, I mean, it's of course it's not only technology, but like there's a bunch of things that goes along with it. You kind of buy products off an Amazon, like halfway across the world, like sitting in US from China, for example, and so on, right? Like, so this is all ways and means in which trust has evolved over the centuries, and technology has played a huge part. And so I think blockchains play a part in kind of increasing economic and social coordination, right? Like, it's just basically how do we let people interact with people, right? Like, does it have to be through private financial rails, government financial rails, like, or through blockchains, for example, right? Like, so that's kind of the framing I would say. And in general, like, when you ask me like where this is all going to end, right? Like, so we have to kind of zoom out a bit and ask, where are we, like, what is the step function, what are we kind of giving a solution to? Like, if you kind of look at, like, let's say using a bank, for example, or let's say Venmo, like, I don't want to get into more, the regulatory bits or the govern, like, where it is more controversial. But let's say look at a Venmo, for example, right? Like, so when you are, kind of transitioning from, again, right? Like, I don't really mean using a global Venmo, for example, because Venmo works best within a country, for example, and so on. But you get the point, right? Like, the trust assumptions that you use for using a Venmo and compared to a blockchain solution, right? Like, so that is the delta in trust assumptions that you are taking as a normal user, right? Like, now, how do we explain this to normal users? That is a separate point, right? Like, but most users, I am pretty sure, don't understand the difference between using a Venmo and using, let's say, a Venmo clone on a blockchain, for example. But there's a huge delta in trust assumptions. Now, some people like to kind of give this opinion that, okay, Bitcoin security or Ethereum security is, like, by far the best security you can get. But see, ultimately, you have to go past the rhetoric and figure out, like, what is it, what are people really indexing on, right? Like, so this is, so a high amount of cryptographic security is very important, but how high? Who defines the number in general, right? Like, I
And
mean,
when you mean like cryptographic security, just for the listeners? Is that just like the stake weight amount to get to the 1/3 and 2/3 thresholds to start messing
Yeah,
with the network?
yeah. Sorry, just to be, yeah. Just to clarify, yes, cryptoeconomic security means, like how much amount we put into securing a system. Generally, most systems use a proof of stake weighted methodology for doing this. There is a 2 by 3 assumption. It can be different. Like BTC does proof of work. There's a 51%, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But
And maybe
essentially,
to dive
yes.
into that a little bit, because I feel like, I don't know if it was Eigenlayer, maybe Babylon, have kind of really been pushing for this economic security. Uh, do you feel like that economic security, I guess, is more useful in the world where you have 100 million uh, layer twos or kind of restaking applications that need to bootstrap or app chains versus like,
Like I think maybe like let me. I think since like uh, come. I'm not trying to slot you, but like you like Solana very much in general, right? Like so. In that sense, right, like let's frame Solana as an example here, right? Like so the Solana, like you could actually theoretically break it into two parts, right? Like so there is a more crypto economic consensus part of, or the proof of stake part of Solana, and then there is the SVM, for example, the actual execution environment, for example, and so on, right? Like of course it's not like zero or one, or I mean, there's quite a bit of overlap between how these two work. But there are teams now that are kind of trying to take the SVM and then trying to build a roll up, for example. And so it's actually really, if you kind of think of it, right, like it's really it's difficult to kind of get all the transactions onto and get it executed by one system, right? Like that's just how traditional microservices work, right? Like I mean, that's how traditional app architecture has moved over the times. Is that you have one system and you build it as a monolithic system. You kind of get a lot of transaction throughput out of it, but someday you'll have to think about breaking it up, adding more layers, for example, and so on. It's just microservices are on the internet, for example, are built separately, scaled independently based on demand, for example, and so on. So there's a lot of great ideas that Solana has been working on, but in general, the I like to kind of see this is as like a security bootstrapping thing and an execution environment thing, right? Like so, there are two things here. So there's a security layer and an execution layer. The security layer is the more difficult to bootstrap because with any new token that you launch, right, like it's going to have zero value on day one, for example, or some non-zero low value on day one. And then it takes time, right? Like, I mean, Bitcoin has been there for so many years and it has that's why it has cemented its place. Also has been for so long. Solana now been for some time. But if you want to do an L1 today, it's going to be it's very hard, right? Like I mean, of course projects do it, but right, like it's going to be becoming increasingly hard for 100 other L1s to come, for example. Um, so essentially, that is basically so there is this bootstrapping problem and then this execution layer problem. The bootstrapping problem is what Babylon and Eigenlayer, for example, are attempting to solve. It's also like osmosis from the Cosmos ecosystem. Like they did something called mesh security. That was like one of the attempts on this. For example, how do you kind of use security from other chains on a Cosmos chain, for example. So I think so. Those are all good attempts of trying to get this security because necessarily you need to have more innovation on the execution side or on the application side because like you will never get mainstream adoption if you want your application developer to kind of also worry about the protocol side, right? Like, I mean, it's just too tough uh, in general. Um, and so essentially, I think what this will, and going back to your previous question, what this will, I envision this is that it's not going to be an only a roll-up centric world, right? Like it's there's going to be like L1s as well, some L1s with roll-ups on top. I, of course, I have my biases, so I think there will be lot of application specific roll-ups, because see, the mental model of roll-ups is also not very well understood, right? Like most people assume that a roll-up is either an EVM roll-up or an SVM roll-up, right? Like these app specific roll-ups, right now the tooling is not mature, but these are getting increasingly better and better to use. Like I said, someone built out an intent solver roll-up a couple of weeks back on Stacker, for example, and like we are seeing newer and newer examples. And so I think where this will be, this will closely mirror what you see in the on the internet, right? Like there are like big monoliths or big app companies like the Facebooks and the Instagrams, for example, that are pretty big, have huge user activity, but there are also small, like one page websites, like simple mobile apps, for example, which start off at as very small apps or droplets or something like that. And then they grow, right? Like, so that's how I feel. We will certainly see a bunch of L1s. I'm pretty sure Solana is going to be very successful, even more successful in general. Um, but rollups are basically a shortcut to bootstrapping security in general. And one very underappreciated way thing of rollups, and especially like Avail using this data availability sampling, is that if we have like a data availability sampling light client and an execution light client, you are able to now then talk to each other, and that kind of connects all of these together, right? Like so, like if you want synchronicity, for example, you go to Solana, you have you can have access to 1,000 other apps. But like otherwise, like with most apps, you start off standalone. You kind of create your product market fit, and if it grows, you kind of expand. And then when it requires you to access some of these apps, you connect them through something like an Avail Nexus, for example, and so on. So yeah, sorry for the
Yeah.
monologue, but
No, no, no. I agree with a lot of that. I think the microservices to me is a kind of interesting analogy. I definitely think of new or layer twos as like new execution environments. And kind of my mental model now has been like you have these high performance kind of layer ones, even Avail, that's really focused on the data synchronization at the layer one. And then you have these layer twos as new execution environments where you can take like arbitrary large amounts of compute, run a supercomputer, create a proof, and then have that be asynchronous. And if you win, or if you want to, post that on kind of that synchronous layer one that will synchronize that data with all the applications there or all the other L2s to post that information. And so in one world, I kind of see you have these high throughput chains that are focused on the data synchronization. In the other part of the world, you have the asynchronous world where it's L2s that can create large proofs and then post them. That's more asynchronous, but that's totally fine because it allows you to create new execution environments or new uh, arbitrarily large amounts of compute that you wouldn't be able to normally run on kind of an integrated layer one.
no, absolutely, absolutely. And like you also, I mean, so generally most people talk about better execution environments, better data modeling, better data structure implementations. I'm also kind of very bullish on authentication access measures, for example, right? Like so right now you have gas markets, for example, for accessing any blockchain. Why can't this be traditional Web2 style access tokens, for example, right? Like so, in general, because all of this can be done, right? Like, see, essentially, on blockchains are a spam mitigation strategy, right? Like you want some fees so that people don't spam you. But that is just one way. You can have, because you disassociate the from this from the base layer, right? Like the base layer needs to have some standard notion of, like a gas token, for example, which used to coordinate activity. But when you have these rollups on top, right, like you can have all of these rollups also have different access mechanisms. So theoretically, you can have like a rollup with an, like which you can subscribe to, say, let's say 1,000 transactions at $1, for example, or so on. And this is, you just get like a API key, for example, and then you access these, right? Like this is just one example. There can be better ways of doing this, but I'm trying to tell you that you can, because of this layering, you can actually come up with these new sorts of access measures, because ultimately um, the roll up on top, right, like doesn't have to be as like doesn't have to be have the exact copy of the base layer, right? Like that's
I
a
think it should be differentiated.
yeah, of course, right? Like so um that's kind of my mental model for some of these app specific rollups, right? Like why can't we make transactions via subscription model, for example, and so on, right? Like so those kind of things I think we'll start seeing over the next 6 months, 12 months, and you have these rollups now being written in TypeScript, in Rust, for example. Like if you look at Stacker, it's written, you can write rollups in TypeScript, for example.
Yeah.
Sovereign Labs, like helps you write rollups in Rust, for example. And so these are much more accessible to the average developer, is what
Yeah.
I feel, right? Like, and so you also have to index on the friction of lowering the friction that a mainstream developer brings to the table. Because see, we talk to various project teams, for example, and so of course crypto native developers are pretty like fast to kind of take up all of this on. But if you're talking to, like, let's say, like a developer in a regular company in Web 2, for example, and they're just trying to look at this stuff, and it's like, oh, I have to learn Solidity, and like I have to learn this data model. I have to put my, like, I have to create my data model, and then I have to retrofit into the model that the blockchain wants me to. For example, to read the data, I have to kind of index the data, index the whole blockchain, then parse my data out of that, for example, and do it on a continuous basis, for example. So it's of course I'm like there's more and more tooling coming out that kind of simplifies this, but even today it's not a very easy experience for a application developer, right? Like
Yeah.
so these are all things that we need to index on, because see, basically, like if you kind of look at the mobile app development stage at the moment, right? Like today, like there are like thousands or maybe tens of thousands of apps that are submitted to the App Store daily. Only one of them or maybe 10 of them break out in some significant way uh, in general, right? Like so, I mean, the transition from a era where there were only a few mobile app developers to one where there are thousands of apps being submitted to the App Store is because now the friction of like developing a mobile app has become so low that like you have all kinds of apps being created and submitted. And so in blockchain, we need to get to that place, because like I like to this example a lot, where something like an Uber or an Instagram was not built on day one when the mobile OSs were launched, right? Like it took a fair bit of experimentation and iteration for someone to figure out. Yeah, I mean, the GPS, the user carries around the mobile everywhere, and you have this GPS capability. How can I apply this to the passenger driver taxi matching problem, for example? Or like Instagram, where okay, the camera is now going everywhere with the user. Can I do a social filtering sort of mechanic on top, right? Like, so these are all applications which I don't think the mobile OS developers really thought of, right? Like, application developers had to do a lot of iterations to get to this point. Now, I think, like, if you kind of think of Uber, Instagram, they're very commonplace, but like, it's not very easy to come up with an Uber on, like when the first mobile OS came out. I still remember I did my first mobile app, like back in 2007 or something like that, 8, I think maybe. This was on a Windows mobile. Um, and the best I could think of was that let me write a survey app, right? Like, because at the time, surveys used to be filled out on paper, for example, and so it was a. So I mean, I'm just trying to kind of frame this in general.
Yeah. And I think, and when we spoke in September of last year, I think Avail was very much ahead of the time because I think it was very still kind of non-consensus at that point to build a high throughput DA layer. I think it will seem obvious in retrospect that you need more data to make more scalable applications. But at that point in time, the market did not reward that thinking. And so congrats on the recent raise and being able to continue out building out the vision. I think today there are now, in every kind of bull market, so to speak, the noise gets louder. And I think both VCs and engineers can sometimes get distracted with the shiny new thing. Previously, it was probably app chains. Now it's been L2s in the past. And it doesn't mean that the shiny new thing is bad. It just means it's shiny and that's where the attention is. Today, it's probably Eigenlayer and restaking, as we've talked about. And I think with all these ecosystems, the most important thing is actually getting engineers to build applications so we can get to products. What is kind of the pitch from the Avail side to say, hey, come to Avail, deploy your layer 2. We have the tooling, the infrastructure, whatever you need to build the best product possible. Don't build on an Eigenlayer. Don't build on a Solana. Don't build on Sui or Monad or whatever. Build here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, right? Like, I mean, in general, so let me kind of rephrase this as, like, so Avail is like, who is Avail for, right? Like, first, in general, like, we build very low level infra, right? Like, it's not for developers directly. Of course, developers can build directly on Avail, but essentially, our first primary consumer is the rollup stack, for example, right? Like, so we work with all the major rollup stacks: Arbitrum, Optimism, Polygon, Starkware, ZK Sync, Stacker, Sovereign Labs, like all the newer application specific rollup stacks as well. Like Movement Labs, for example, and so on, right? Like, so first of all, and so like our pitch to developers is, like, we kind of work very closely with these rollup stack developers, and then when we are talking to developers, like, I think actually I was just talking to someone before this podcast, and like, yeah, I was discussing this point, right? Like, developers don't ask really us whether to use Avail DA or Celestia DA or Eigen DA, for example. To be very frank, right? Like, that's not the first question they come from. They ask us about what rollup stack do you recommend? Like, that is the primary question that comes to us, and we spend a lot of time educating people about the state of the rollup stack, for example, what it is good for, how much expensive it is, how inexpensive it is, what options you can have, for example. So first part is, like, it's primarily the rollup stack that we end up kind of recommending, and then of course the choice of DA comes after that, because like essentially the developer, the rollup developer is choosing their tool stack, right? Like, and DA is an important part, but it's one part of the whole thing. So that's why, like, essentially we kind of, the pitch is primarily via the rollup stacks. That is number one. Second is essentially Like, to be very frank, because there's so much DA or ordering bandwidth that is coming to the market, like all DA is going to be very commoditized. Like, it's a no-brainer, right? Like, I mean, fees are going to be low, for example, and so essentially, and it's very hard to reason about, like, the security assumptions, for example, right? Like or the implementation, like whether we do validity proofs, something that like based on KZG polynomial commitments, very close to what Ethereum wants to do on its bank sharding roadmap. But like, so I mean, yeah, okay, you also have Eigen DA, Celestial DA, for example. So I mean, it's very difficult to kind of like for people to differentiate, because it's necessarily a very low level infra in that sense. I think how we kind of try to say this is that, okay, you have to think beyond the initial mm, uh, technical tool stack choice, right? Like, so once you kind of choose your tool stack, once you kind of spin up your chain, right? Like, you're not going to have to figure out or worried about the execution environment or the DA reliability, for example. Like, all of these systems are going to be pretty robust, for example. What you need to figure out then is, where are your users going to come from? Where are you going to pull liquidity from? How do users bridge to your chain? Do people have to bridge via Ethereum from other rollups? Like, how do you bring liquidity to your chain? Like, how do you ensure that users have a very smooth onboarding to your chain, right? Like, you cannot be the 100th EVM rollup with no differentiator, right? Like, I mean, it's very hard, right? Like, and it cannot be that we were the first rollup to use a particular DA solution or a particular rollup stack, right? Like, it has to be much more, right? Like, you have to bring in users, keep those users, ensure that there are useful apps so that users stay on, for example, right? Like, so it's much more than that. And so I would say it's there's a lot of business building that we kind of do along with our like people or projects that work with Avail, right? Like, I've gone through this cycle now. I've been 7 years here. Back in 2017 when I founded Polygon, right? Like, I've gone through various cycles, talked to a bunch of developers, and essentially, like, what they want to do is build useful businesses and projects, and it requires a lot of handholding, it requires a lot of insight, for example. And so, of course, technically we build solutions, it meets a need, they do it, for example. But you need much more than that. You need, like, venture building, business building skills, access to investors, access to the right strategy changes, for example. Um, there's a bunch of things that happen, right? Like, and so we certainly, like, help a lot in that. But having said that, right? Like, having said that, see, as I said, like, DA is going to be a commodity, and you really have to focus on building out value accrual up the stack for and this is, I'm speaking more from an Avail perspective, right? Like, so we of course provide the DA, but as I mentioned before, right, like, we also build Nexus and Fusion because we are very conscious of how to think about value accrual. We think value accrual will happen not only on the DA side but also on the execution side, for example. And if you want to have accrue value on the execution side, you also need to have some hook onto the there, and that's why we build Nexus, which is basically roll up connecting roll up play as well as, like, some sort of sequencer coordination play, for example. And so we have hooks there so that, like, so that we build that useful infra.
And
Um,
maybe that's a
eh,
good segue into Nexus, because I think going back to your earlier point, people are trying to understand the infrastructure of the layer 2 ecosystem. They use Base? Should they use Arbitrum, Optimism, Polygon as well? It's not necessarily the DA layer, so to speak. And so I think, as you kind of pointed out, some of that roadmap decisions have ultimately resulted in fragmentation. And I think one of the cool things about Ethereum in the early days was DeFi summer and everybody wanting to use Ethereum and having that kind of coordinated layer. And then once you fractured that, then the communities also slightly became fractured as well. And there was like, all right, build on Arbitrum, don't build on Base, et cetera, et cetera. But it sounds like Nexus is the key that would allow this unification, not only for applications, but also on the community side. Can you dive deeper into Nexus and kind of what you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So just to step back, right? Like, what is Nexus? Nexus is, so with Avail DA, we kind of enable a lot of rollups on top. But as Logan said, that these rollups make the user experience pretty fragmented. Like, so now you have to build some sort of interconnectivity layer, right? Like, so you can call it like an interoperability layer, for example, and so on. But I like to call it the unification layer. And interoperability in a rollup context is slightly different from a conventional L1 to L1 interoperability, like a bridging kind of a thing, because rollup interoperability is best done on a shared DA layer, right? Like, so that's the premise which we begin with. Like, but the shared DA layer is not enough. You need to build more components on top, right? Like, so we do this via Nexus using this clever combination of data availability sampling or the ordering verification and the execution proof aggregation bit, right? Like, so that's how we kind of use to construct this. But Nexus also has a relatively less documented thing called which kind of does handles the sequencer or the operator coordination bit, which I will skip for the time being. But like, these are the two architectural components of Nexus, and the way is, I mean, technically it might sound simple, but the way, as like Logan likes framed it, is okay. We went into the frantic future, but now it's fragmented. Now how do we kind of like make this better, right? Like, so you figure out a way how to connect these rollups together. But how do we connect these rollups together, right? Like, it's not we cannot go back to multi-sig based message passing, for example, right? Like, so you need to have a better way. So the shared D layer is one precondition, and then you need to have these light clients, especially these volatility proof based light clients that can kind of prove the state of one rollup to another rollup, right? Like, so you have to prove the ordering and you have to prove the execution. These are the two bits. So we have an ordering light client on Avail DA, and then we have this execution light client based on, or execution proof, state proof based on, let's say ZK piece, for example, and so on. And so we use this to kind of construct this shared notion of message passing, which then you can eventually get to a position where you have users having funds on various rollups, for example, and let's assume that there is like an SVM rollup on there, and there's just a lot of DeFi apps here, and you have like a app specific rollup where which mostly works independently, but like someone wants to fund the account, and so then they can like talk to the SVM rollup and then get the funds back, for example. You can think of the mental model of this is probably like a Venmo in the US, where the Venmo you can think of is this one big payment rollup with millions of users. And but when they want to kind of fund the account, they have to talk to the bank account or the credit card, for example, to top the wallet balance from, right? Like, so you kind of like you have this big financial system which can be synchronous, for example, and so on. But you have these pockets of application space where you can go deeper, right? Like, and you can have various different mechanisms here. For example, you can sign on with Twitter, for example, and so on. I'm just kind of trying to give the idea. So that's kind of Nexus, right? Like, I mean, rollups lead to fragmentation for sure, but like this is our attempt at solving the fragmentation issue.
And I probably just had one of your old colleagues on from Polygon with Brendan. How does this ultimately, would you kind of highlight to either the engineers or just people that are trying to learn the differences and nuances between Nexus and what Polygon and the aggregation layer is doing there?
Yeah, yeah. I think the Aglier is also, like a pretty neat solution. I think originated primarily from the aggregated proof of the Polygon CDK. So, because Polygon CDKs all use the same proving system, it's very easy to aggregate proofs from different Polygon CDK chains. That's where it started from. But I saw a recent draft of the proposal, for example, and it has morphed a bit into kind of also allowing for inclusion or validity inclusion checks, for example, from other rollups. I still need to kind of see the design there in detail to kind of make a very direct comparison. But essentially, how Avail Nexus works is we kind of work with these different ecosystems. Essentially, like if you look at GK Sync ecosystem, for example, the hyperchains there have a proving system, for example, and all their hyperchains will have the same proving system, and it's easy to aggregate these together. Similarly, Starkware has their own mechanism, and like Arbitrum Optimism have their own mechanisms for coordinating chains between each other, like the super chain from Optimism, like the Orbit ecosystem from Arbitrum, for example. And so, if you kind of look at this, right, like they are different ecosystems evolving in different ways based on the implementation, based on the proving system, for example. And it's like the tool stack in general, right? Like it's very specific to the project, and it's very difficult to kind of come up with the protocol that sits in between and has to have everyone to opt in and connect these chains together. So, how the best way to think about Avail Nexus is more like a permissionless sort of unification layer, in the sense that, and we are doing actually releasing a prototype of connecting a ZK sync chain with a Polygon ZK EVM chain, like this quarter sometime. So what we really do is we take in these proofs from these different proving systems and actually verify them in a common program, for example. And so we are verifying the state of these chains together, and essentially, in some sense, like aggregating this into a single proof, for example. And so essentially, if you kind of think of it, these ecosystems are all of them are friends, for example, but like they are, to be honest, very competitive, uh, and don't really collaborate with each other very deeply. And so essentially, I think that we need like this third party like Avail to kind of sit between these teams and enable them to connect to each other.
Since they are competitive, what do you think are going to be like the competitive feature set that makes one win over another? Is it going to be the data synchronization? Is it going to be the amount of throughput that they can do? Or is it the economic security, having large full nodes? Since they are going to at least try to compete with each other, even if they're friendly on the front end. What do you think those unique product features are going to be to really differentiate the technical stacks between each?
Yeah, I think essentially it all comes down to what sort of quality applications you engender on in the ecosystem. That is my fervent belief, right? Like, I mean, of course, you can say an optimism stack is different from an arbitrum stack in terms of implementation. So, of course, right, Optimism didn't have fraud proof for a long time, but they are now releasing that pretty soon. So, once they once they put that into production, right? Like, how do you really like differentiate between like developing on an EVM chain on Optimism versus that of an Arbitrum, for example, right? Like, so I'm saying those are delta differences that a lot of developers will gloss over. So I think what these ecosystems have been doing, like if you look at Arbitrum, for example, they came up with Stylus, which is like a very underappreciated move that Arbitrum has done. Is how can we allow people to program in arbitrary browser compatible languages, for example, and also allow for arbitrary high amounts of computation to be packaged, for example. So Starkware has been doing their own thing, like with Cairo, for example, coming up with a different tool set and making it easy for people to do large amounts of computation. You can actually, like I was looking at this ML toolkit from in the Starkware ecosystem, which can like do a lot of analytical inference, for example, and so on. Um, and like all the others, for example, right? Like so, I think it will boil down to what sort of application ecosystem, developer ecosystem you can actually bring about, whether that is via the technology, whether that is through access to users, liquidity, for example, whether it is through, like actual, as I said, business building or, in that sense, for example, right? So I think it will be on how these people attract a great app developer community. I think all infrastructure projects, including Avail, including others, for example, right? Like if we are not able to bootstrap a great app developer community, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah. Uh, well, Anurag, maybe shifting slightly, you were at the forefront in kind of the space thinking about Avail, thinking about how to do high throughput DA. The landscape has shifted quite substantially since we spoke in September. A lot of the early things that you mentioned about requiring high throughput came true. It's also, as we're recording, so token 2049 is also going on. What would be your call to builders, engineers in the ecosystem that you would like to see built on Avail, or utilizing some of the more high throughput nature that Avail offers to really push the industry forward?
I mean, see, in general, okay. I mean, I certainly Avail is a very high throughput DA provider for sure. I think I just kind of differentiate it a little bit by saying that it's not only a high data throughput thing, it's also, like we actually spend considerable effort in building out the data availability sampling part, which is actually the crown jewel of Avail DA. Because, of course, you can build highly scalable apps on top of Avail DA but data availability sampling, like it's a fragmented user experience. So just wanted to kind of
Do you
give
think
that.
data availability sampling will be kind of required on all throughput chains going forward? Or do you think it'll be less common, but it'll still like will still migrate to high throughput?
I think all chains, like any important chain that does data, like is focusing on data availability, will needs to implement data availability sampling, right? Like I mean, that's going to be pretty standard because essentially, I mean, you can increase the data throughput as much as you want, for example, but it also has to have some sort of easy verification by other blockchains. Not for, like I think the verification part has been like a little bit misunderstood. Of course, users can verify ordering, for example, and execution by light clients, but it's not only for their users. It's for other blockchains to understand what is the state on your blockchain, really, what is the ordering on your blockchain, and so that is pretty important. Like essentially, so if you are going into a multi-chain world, how do these chains talk to each other, right? Like I mean, that's the fundamental. Like, do we want to have multi-sig bridges, or do you want to have like client level message passing, for example? So that's one thing. In general, I would say application specific roll-up stack tooling is something that I would like to really see much more progress on in general. Like this could be like it's a whole new way of thinking of app building, right? Like you had like the original app builders were like, of course, smart contracts on Ethereum and Solana, for example. But if you kind of look at it, a Cosmos app chain is also an embodiment of an app, right? Like, so you have an Osmosis which implements a DEX on a chain. You have DYDX as a chain, for example. These are all app specific chains. Now, initially, the whole process of bootstrapping an app chain was so cumbersome, so daunting that only few did it, and not many survived to see the tale, right? Like so, so in general, but I think now the whole paradigm has changed. The whole concept of shared security is changing. Now you can do much more experiments. Like as I said, coming back to like the point that I made, right? Like why can't someone build a roll up with no conventional gas metering, for example, like with no fees, with like, let me buy subscriptions, 1,000 transaction subscriptions with $1, for example, and so on, right? Like so that is a kind of tooling that I really look forward to people building, so that even see essentially you need, as I said, I'm kind of repeating myself like a parrot, is that we need useful apps on this infra, right? Like, and the only way to kind of make this more and more easier is to build better tooling, app development tooling, and then of course getting them access to users, getting them access to liquidity, and those, that's the least which we can do.
Yeah, I'm very excited for users. I think we've seen kind of the boom and bust of user cycles. I think in 2020 and 2021, a lot of it, some of the hardships ultimately came from higher gas fees. I think with the high throughput blockchains today that exist, that's no longer the case. Well, now Solana is going through some issues. Hopefully, they can resolve those. But it doesn't seem like fees is the predominant bottleneck anymore. We have high throughput DA layers. We have parallel processing and different VMs that can process a lot of transactions simultaneously. And now, what I'm excited about, especially for the remainder of 2024, is consumer applications and actually using blockchains, because I think that is the missing piece. And I very much appreciate all the engineers that kind of kept up with it throughout the bear market, because they're the ones now that are really at the forefront trying interesting experiments, whether it's on L2s, L3s, on ETH, on integrated chains. And someone's going to crack the nut, so to speak, of that first breakout consumer application. And I'm excited that that iteration process continues to happen and the infrastructure is becoming less and less of a bottleneck over time.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I think you're very right in the sense that there's a lot of capacity going online, and in general, like things are getting better and better in general. And so I think the thing is that we also sometimes underestimate the kind of industry or the global access that crypto brings us, because crypto also brings you a global user base from day one, right? Like, I mean, nowhere, no other technology stack really give, at least gives you, it doesn't necessarily guarantees it, but it gives you an access to a user from any corner of the world. And of course, bunch of things needed to make that much more easier, for example. But structurally, that's the only infrastructure that gives you access to users from across the world at any given time, for example. And so now, how do we kind of make use of it best via consumer app, via B2B app, like a B2C app, for example, and so on, right? Like that is up to the, you know, like all the community, for example, and all the new developers that are out there, right? Like, so I mean, even if you look at something as simple as USDT, for example, right? Like in countries like I spent a couple of weeks in Turkey last year. Turkey experiences probably 20 to 30% inflation, and it's not possible to keep your cash in a bank because it's just going to depreciate away, right? Like you have to find other things, and so you'll see like people keeping cash in USDT, BTC, and other assets, for example, and stablecoin, like it's just like so. This is one of the ways, right? Like I mean, essentially, outside of the US, people don't appreciate. Sorry, inside the US, people don't appreciate the role of the US dollar playing in emerging economies, for example, right? Like so, just people just want to get their hands on it, and things like a USDT or a USDC or a stable coins, and so that itself is one of the features where like how can you kind of take one localized aspect and give it to people from a global audience, right? Like so USDT or stablecoins are one example of this, but like what are these other examples? How can we kind of like enable newer behavior patterns to access this global user base? That's, I think, that's a good tough nut to crack.
I think that is the magic of blockchains. Accessing these global markets, having kind of the shared liquidity, being able to really unify markets where historically they are very fragmented, unlocking really bank accounts, stable currencies, the things that the traditional first world countries have really had access to for a long time, but expanding that globally and really treating everybody in the world as a first class citizen in terms of bringing this kind of archaic financial market to everybody in the world. And then when you financialize some of those, what unique incentives can be brought online to enable even better coordination and better applications. It is a very exciting world that we're heading towards, and one that, frankly, I just can't wait to see what builders enable, because there is a lot of ideas. And I think, to your point earlier, when you have an iPhone, when the App Store comes out, it takes a while for people to realize, oh, I have a camera, I have a GPS, I can do things like Instagram and Uber and Lyft. And conceptually, those were not even in my wheelhouse prior to thinking about that, but it just takes some time for engineers to continue to iterate, find what works and what doesn't work, and leverage the unique capabilities of the underlying infrastructure. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast, sharing the wisdom that you brought on about Avail, all the different updates to the Avail ecosystem, and what you guys are planning for the future. So thank you again.
Yep. Thanks, Logan. Fantastic to
Thank
be
you
here.
so much.